In alliances and deep-seated grievances, conflicts like the war in Ukraine and the war involving Israel reveal just how layered and complex modern warfare has become. One is fueled by territorial ambition and great power rivalry, the other by decades-old disputes over sovereignty, security, and survival. Yet, both share a common thread: the high human cost and the enduring question of how nations can reconcile their interests with the demand of peace. Against this backdrop, the pro-African vision emerging from Senegal stands out, not merely as a political stance, but as a bold statement about self-determination and the continent's right to chart its own course. Could the principles of sovereignty and self-reliance championed in Dakar offer a part to breaking the cycles of dependence and conflict we see on the global stage? This would be our focus on today's Flash News. I am Star Smart, and welcome to the Flash News. Israel frames the current conflict as a defensive, multi-theater war driven by Iran and its proxies, with Hamas at its core in Gaza and additional pressure from Hezbollah, Yemen-based Houthis, and other Iran-aligned militias. Very recently in Jerusalem at a United States Independence Day reception hosted by Newsmax, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu reiterated the 7 fronts language and added an 8th front, the battle for truth, explicitly thanking Newsmax for helping defeat lies with truth.
7 fronts against Iran and its proxies. The 8th front, the battle for truth. And Newsmax, you have let the truth circle the globe against the lies that have circled it before and continue to do so. There's only one way to beat the lies, and that's with the truth. Thank you for standing up with Israel. Thank you for standing up with the truth.
Well, the message was twofold. Israel argues it is fighting not only rockets and cross-border attacks, but also a persistent cycle of misreporting and propaganda that obscures intent, context, and the laws of war, constraints within which it says the Israel Defense Forces operate. Civilian suffering is undeniable and central to the diplomatic narrative, even as Jerusalem stresses its right and obligation to dismantle Hamas's military capacity and recover Israeli hostages. There is a growing recognition that civilian suffering in Gaza is immense and morally searing. Israeli officials contend that Hamas embeds fighters and weapons in civilian areas, making urban combat excruciatingly costly, while insisting that the IDF issues warnings, opens corridors when possible, and coordinates the conflictions to mitigate harm. Critics counter that the scale of destruction and death far exceeds any claim of proportionality. This chasm between intent and outcome is where Israel's 8-front messaging has locked in. Officials say misattributed strikes, staged images, and context-stripped casualty claims muddy understanding of what the IDF is actually doing and why. Yet the visceral catastrophe on the ground remains, and acknowledging it has become essential to sustaining international legitimacy as operations continue. Over 100 humanitarian organizations recently signed a joint statement accusing Israel of weaponizing aid in Gaza, saying that authorizations are denied or conditioned in ways that impede life-saving works as hunger deepens. Israel rejects the accusation, saying the rules tightened in March aim to ensure relief reaches civilians rather than Hamas, and that it does not cap aid for punitive reasons. Let's take a listen.
I followed you when you said the other day that the problem in Gaza is that not starvation for the Palestinians, and certainly for Hamas. Hamas, you said, needs Ozempic. Well, it could be funny, but it isn't. It could be funny because it's not funny because the deliberate starvation policy, the only deliberate starvation policy that we see in Gaza is the starving of our hostages. And you can see that when you look at their captors and you see our emaciated hostages and these corpulent guards, tormentors. And that's a way to puncture the falsehoods, because the eighth front that I was talking about is the battle to puncture the lies and bring out the truth. Israel has no starvation policy. It had and has a policy to separate the civilians from combatants on two fronts.
While the humanitarian side points to July denials and a deteriorating food security picture, Israel counters that diversion, risk, and security inspections are unavoidable in a war against an adversary embedded within the civilian grid. This back and forth has become a litmus test for Israel's claim that it prosecutes the war within legal bounds while making space for relief, even when such pauses and corridors impose tactical cost. A recurring argument from Israeli officials and many of their supporters is that Hamas rarely faces equivalent diplomatic or media accountability for ceasefire collapse, rocket fire from civilian zones, or its handling of hostages. The position is that Hamas's rigid negotiating posture, especially on prisoner exchange and security guarantees, prolongs the war and multiplies civilian risk on both sides.
We have sent millions and millions of text messages, phone calls. This has never happened before in a war, that the army that is fighting terrorists in an urban environment calls on the civilians in enemy territory to leave, and the enemy shoots them if they try to leave. And then Israel is blamed for genocide. That's ridiculous. It is a blatant falsehood, and one of the first and most important lies that has to be exposed. The genocidal element is Hamas. The genocidal element is the Iranian axis that openly calls for the annihilation and extermination of Israel and many Jews. It calls for the death of America, that's true. But people don't understand that it begins with their attempt to destroy Israel, because we stand in their way.
Well, within this logic, Israel says it has repeatedly made room for humanitarian efforts and ceasefire frameworks, only to see them fray when Hamas refuses terms that would both free captives and durably end hostilities. Jerusalem's defenders add that as long as Hamas's governance and military structures remain intact, a reversion to violence is a question of when, not if, a premise that hardens Israeli deterrence goals and colors how it describes proportionately. Settlement strategy and the smart-rich shockwaves is what we're about to get into when we see the diplomatic temperature rising further when Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich announced the revival and approval steps for the long-stalled E1 plan. More than 3,000 housing units intended to link Ma'ale Adumim with Jerusalem, declaring it would bury the idea of a Palestinian state. International opponents say E1 would sever East Jerusalem from the West Bank and splinter the territory, rendering a contiguous Palestinian state nearly impossible. The announcement underscores the split within Israel's own political spectrum over end-state outcomes and fuels arguments that wartime policy is entrenched in facts on the ground that narrow the path to diplomacy. For Israel's critics, E1 epitomizes maximalism for its backers. It is strategic depth and a response to sustained security threats after October 7th. The hostages and the prize of humanitarian space is what we see as Israel's core war aims repeatedly circling back to returning abducted citizens and ensuring the October 7th attacks cannot be repeated. Officials argue that pauses aid convoys and deconfliction measures, however costly militarily, have been created and extended many times. But that progress on hostages requires real leverage over Hamas and enforceable arrangements that do not simply reset the battlefield. Now, this is the tightrope to maintain space for humanitarian actions and diplomacy without ceding the initiative. Israeli rhetoric at the Newsmax reception cast this balance as part of the truth front to demonstrate with facts and footage that humanitarian facilitation has occurred and that obstruction often traces to fighting conditions, militant interference, or security intelligence that the government is reluctant to expose in full. And on regional and international cross-currents, relocation rumors and arms politics, reports that Israel was in discussion to resettle Palestinians from Gaza in South Sudan has triggered swift pushback from Juba, which publicly denied any talks to receive Gazans. The denial damned a flurry of commentary about mass transfer scenarios and underlined how volatile third country settlement rumors can be in wartime diplomacy. Meanwhile, European-Israeli defense ties have been shaken by Berlin's policy shifts. German manufacturer Rank has said it will move or consider moving production of transmissions for Israeli tanks to the United States to circumvent new curbs, an episode that has touched domestic German politics while signaling Israel's intent to diversify critical supply lines as the war drags on. Taken together, Israel's stated rationale is stark. Prevent a repeat of October 7th by dismantling Hamas's military capacity, restore credible deterrence across multiple Iranian-aligned fronts, bring hostages home, and keep humanitarian channels open enough to prevent collapse without enabling a rearmament cycle. The 8th front formulations tries to capture a battlefield of narratives where images, partial claims, and the fog of urban combat can invert cause and effect. Now, to sustain friends and fence-sitters alike, Jerusalem has leaned on the language of self-defense, reciprocity under fire, and the laws of war. Critics point to civilians' toll, aid impediments, and settlement moves like E1 as proof that policy has outpaced international law and that long-term security cannot be built on punitive devastation. The truth of the war in diplomatic terms is that both claims exist simultaneously. A legitimate self-defense case pressed against a backdrop of extraordinary civilian suffering. Israel's argument is that the former cannot be abandoned because the latter is intolerable. Its opponents counter that the former is delegitimized by the latter's skill. And that is it for Israel. We see that in Russia, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky traveled to Berlin on August 13th, 2025, where he joined a high-level virtual meeting hosted by German Chancellor Friedrich Merz. The conference brought together European leaders and the United States President Donald Trump to establish red lines before the upcoming Trump-Putin summit in Alaska scheduled for August 15th. The session was presented as a prelude to a follow-up trilateral meeting involving Putin, Zelensky, and Trump. Provided the Alaska talks proceed productively, France's Emmanuel Macron reaffirmed that Ukraine must have a seat at the negotiating table and that any discussions of territorial change must occur only with its consent. Merz underscored that Ukraine's security and European interests must be respected throughout. We also see that after the Berlin summit, President Trump characterized the discussion with Zelensky, which he had, as very good, rating it a perfect 10 in terms of friendliness and engagement.
We had a very good call. He was on the call. President Zelensky was on the call. I would rate it a 10, very, very friendly.
Oh, well, while voicing optimism, he offered limited detail, affirming that he would push for a ceasefire during the Alaska summit and warned of very severe consequences for Russia if President Putin failed to de-escalate. Though he held back on formal security pledges involving NATO, he signaled openness to future arrangement with Ukraine.
No, it was always going to be, I was going to meet with President Putin, and then after that, I'm going to call the leaders and President Zelensky. I'm going to call President Zelensky, and then I'll call, probably in that order, the leaders. There's a very good chance that we're going to have a second meeting, which will be more productive than the first, because the first is I'm going to find out where we are and what we're doing.
Well, on August 14th, the United Kingdom's Prime Minister Keir Starmer greeted President Zelensky at Downing Street with a warm embrace, a symbol of unyielding support. Their discussion focused on durable peace, security guarantees, and defense support, including drone production. Starmer reaffirmed that Ukraine's borders must never be changed by force and highlighted a coalition of the willing committed to safeguarding Kyiv's sovereignty. Now, what will Trump and Putin discuss in Alaska? As the world watches the Alaska summit, misgivings linger. Putin praised what he termed sincere efforts by the United States to advance peace and may even explore arms control arrangements. Still, Russia's territorial ambitions remain unchanged, intensifying the urgency for Ukrainian involvement in any negotiation. European leaders, while cautiously encouraging, remain wary of a deal that sidelines Ukraine or rewards aggression. Now, are we witnessing a genuine path towards ceasefire, or merely a prelude to further backroom bargaining that sidelines Kyiv, is the question. And can the promises of security, guarantee, and coalition support hold firm once the cameras stop rolling, is another question of concern. Well, away from the words with the West and in the Middle East, we see in Africa, Senegal's bold move, a reciprocity action. Now, Senegal has taken a decisive step towards reshaping global travel relations with the enactment of its Reciprocity Act on visas, a groundbreaking policy that charges citizens of Western countries the exact amounts that they charge Senegalese nationals for an entry visa. Now, announced by President Bassirou Diomaye Faye, this new measure applies exclusively to non-African nations, with all African countries exempt from the charges. The move is widely seen as an economic strategy to strengthen Senegal's coffers while making a clear statement to nations that have long imposed steep, often prohibitive visa fees on African travelers. Beyond revenue, it sends a powerful diplomatic message about fairness, equality, and mutual respect in international relations. Now, what exactly changed and when? The policy was first unveiled on May 17, 2025 in Dakar during a national address in which President Faye described the current imbalance in visa charges as a form of systemic injustice. He emphasized that Senegal's position is not one of hostility, but rather of insisting on reciprocity, a principle deeply embedded in international diplomacy, but often ignored when it comes to Africa. Now, the announcement generated immediate buzz across the continent, with many Africans hailing it as a long overdue assertion of dignity. For decades, African travelers have endured costly, cumbersome, and often humiliating visa processes when visiting Western countries, despite those same nations enjoying comparatively easy access to African destinations. Now we see how the EU has responded and why it matters. Reaction from the international community was swift on this declaration. On May 24, 2025, the European Union responded through its ambassador to Senegal, Jean-Marc Pisani, who told Le Soleil that the European Union was taking the matter seriously at the European level. He clarified that under the Schengen Visa Code, visa issuance remains a national prerogative of individual member states, meaning the EU cannot impose a uniform fee in retaliation. Pisani also sought to highlight existing partnerships and cultural exchanges between Senegal and European nations. But his comments did lead to dampen African support for the move. Analysts viewed his measured tone as an indicator that Europe was treading carefully, aware of the potential ripple effect across the continent if other African nations followed Senegal's lead. While the Senegalese government has since moved forward with implementation plans for the e-visa system that will process applications from non-African travelers under the new fee structure. Now, let's take a look at why this matters for Senegal and for Africa. We'll take a listen from the Prime Minister of Senegal, Ousmane Sonko, presenting the National Economic Recovery Plan to revive Senegal's economy and strengthen its economic sovereignty as part of the reason why it matters.
La première année, 274 milliards. La deuxième, 444 milliards. Et la troisième année, 300.
Well, he says 2,000 to 2,600 billion in the stable, and the injection of these resources should generate approximately 1,062 billion in tax revenue, which will be spread over the 3 years. The first year, 274 billion, the second 44 billion, and the third year 344 billion. This gives a total projected resources of 5,667 billion. Now, officials have explained that the revenues generated will be reinvested in national development projects, particularly in tourism infrastructure, cultural heritage preservation, and digital border control technologies. The government has also stressed that the policy will not only bring in funds, but will level the psychological playing field by ending a one-sided system that has long disadvantaged African citizens. Well, as of August 14, 2025, the Reciprocity Act stands as a rallying point for Pan-African solidarity. Political commentators across the continent have called on other nations to adopt similar policies, noting that a unified approach could significantly shift the tone of Africa's diplomatic engagements with the West. In Senegal, the move has been celebrated domestically as a sign that the government is willing to stand firm against unequal treatment. Now, we see Senegal's move demonstrates that African openness, especially within ECOWAS and the entire continent, can coexist with hard-edged fairness internationally. Reciprocity is not walls. It is a well-lit door with the same rules on both sides. For many Africans, the policy is about more than visas. It is about rewriting the rules of respect between nations and reclaiming agency in the face of decades of imbalanced international travel laws. For the rest of Africa, the lesson is procedural power, codify dignity into digital systems, publish the rules, collect the fees, and invite the world as equals. If widely adopted, Senegal's example could mark the beginning of a new era in Africa's global relations, one where the continent speaks with a louder, united voice, and where respect is not requested, but required. And with that, we've come to the end of today's Flash News. Until next time, I remain Star Smart, and thank you for tuning in.